we sort of talk about this coyote alley where they're sort of running between north of the LIE and between the points where the bays come down, and there's sort of a narrow band there where they have to sort of run that gauntlet and get through there. But once they reach western Nassau, and then once they get to Suffolk County, there's they don't need thousands of acres, they don't need hundreds of acres, they need little patches here and there, unless we give them a chance. That's why we've been saying, like, we know coyotes can be good neighbors. The question on Long Island is whether Long Islanders can be good neighbors and do the things, the couple steps that are going to avoid conflicts.
And that was Enrico Nardone, the executive director of the Seatuck Association. In this episode of the Suffolk Current, we'll be discussing with Enrico the many topics and issues facing Suffolk County with environmental and wildlife conservation. Who would have thought that we'd have coyotes migrating to Suffolk County? We'll be talking about this issue and many more on the Suffolk Current podcast, and I am your host, Craig Lowe. I'm glad to have you on the podcast and hear some of the wisdom that you have to share with our listeners.
Well, thanks. Good to be with you, especially outdoors here at the Scully Estate, and thanks for the kind words.
You've been the executive director of Seatuck for what, 15 years?
20 years, 20 years next month.
Before you came to Seatuck, you're not originally from Long Island. You're from northern Pennsylvania.
Yep.
And an attorney.
Yep. I grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania in the Appalachian Hills there, and went to law school in D.C., and then I was working at the National Audubon Society there in D.C. and met my wife. She's from Long Island, so that's how we moved back to Long Island. That's how I got here.
Now, have you always wanted to work in some form of environmental conservation, wildlife conservation?
At some point, as I was always interested in outdoors and science stuff. So I was a biology major in college, and then it was a pre-med program, and I knew I wasn't interested in that. And at some point, a lot of books and things, and just being aware of what was going on. At some point, I wanted to be involved in conservation efforts, and I didn't see myself as sort of a kicking and screaming advocate. I thought the law was a place that would be a better fit for me, and inspired by some of the work that the big organizations were doing, like Sierra Club. Now it's Earth Justice, but the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund and NRDC, and so I spent some time in Alaska after college, and then came back to go to law school in DC with the idea of I wanted to be an environmental attorney and be involved in conservation work.
Was there any event or particular point in time that occurred to you? Was there? This was the decision this happened, and this is why I made the decision to go in this direction.
I was always outside. My parents took us to a lot of state parks, and we did tours to national parks, and I've fished a lot on the Susquehanna River, and I do remember one moment when I was probably in high school where we grew up. I lived on this mountain, side of a mountain. I spent a lot of time on the top of this mountain. We'd go up there; it was basically open, empty, and we'd hike. And I'd cross-country skied up there, and it was a place with some rocky outcroppings. There was some bouldering around and things, and I remember very distinctly going up one time and getting to the top of this trail where it sort of flattened out at the top of the mountain, and just being like stunned at the fact that all of a sudden it was wide open. There were no trees. It had been cleared. There was a bulldozer there, and somebody owned this property and ended up building a house on the top of the ridge overlooking this valley where we used to sit on the rocks and just look. And now the fact that it was going to be somebody's private place and there were no trespassing signs up, I remember really being just sort of offended by it at first, and just I just couldn't believe it, the fact that was possible, just to go in and clear that place and knock down all the trees. And I think that was the seed, really. And I was in this sort of pre-med program, but it was really books, Edward Abbey and John Muir's stuff, and Leopold, and trying to think of what else I was reading.
Sort of the foundation of the modern environmental movement.
Yeah, that was the stuff that really got me, and I sort of then yeah, I started feeling like I wanted to be a part of that, and there were problems that I could help to fix. So then I spent time in Alaska. Being in Alaska, then you see I was lucky enough to be there in the Tongass National Forest and spending time on islands where there were more bears than people, and seeing really wild places. And then I went to D.C. because I wanted to be around the I was sort of interested in the national policy stuff, and the big national organizations were there. So while I was there, I interned at National Audubon and the Wilderness Society, and what became Earth Justice. So, and then I parlayed that internship at Audubon into a job, and then I moved to Long Island and started at Seatuck. So, which I thought would be a temporary stop, because again, I was really more at the time interested in sort of bigger. I was involved in sort of national policy issues, but issues are everywhere. So it just didn't take long for me to settle in and realize there's a lot to be done here too.
Let's talk a little bit about the bigger policy issues, the bigger picture at 30,000 feet. We talk about conservation of wildlife, and a lot of things come to mind. To my mind, you hear about conservation, it's like saving the different wildlife species in Africa. Mm-hmm. The elephants or the big game, or maybe you hear of a bird in some location that's being threatened by development. But philosophical level, like, should we have conservation? Why does it matter?
Well, it's philosophical, but maybe it's also just ecological for me. Like it's at some point sort of the basis of the ecological health of the planet and why things work. Requires these systems to be in place, and we have just so little knowledge of impacts that we're having sometimes, and it's like Aldo Leopold said. That's the first rule of tinkering is don't throw away any parts, right? And that's for me, that's where it all starts. Like everything we're doing, and for centuries, for millennia, we weren't thinking about those things, and in most cases it didn't matter because we weren't having enough of an impact to make a difference. But as our numbers of human population has grown, our ability to impact things has grown with technology, and we're think about what's happening in the Amazon now. We're having significant impact on places without really understanding what the consequences are. We're paying for consequences now of things that we didn't understand we were doing. Harms we were having without even realizing it. It's a lot of it starts with just a lack of knowledge. I always give an example of pesticides and herbicides and things, and people always say that you read that they're safe and they've been approved by the EPA and there's no problems, and they don't have any impact on non-target species. Especially with insecticides. I always remind people, we don't even have names for half of the insects that we know. We haven't gotten to the point of naming them, let alone fully understanding them, or all the other species that we don't even know yet. There's just so much that we don't understand. I think it takes a lot of hubris to think that we're sure things are not going to be a problem. So, that's the big picture for me. It's just basic ecological functions of the planet that in the end we're reliant on. So.
Now, in the last, in your career, the last 25 years in working in conservation, is it getting better?
I think it's come a long way. I do. I think, I felt like, it doesn't seem like that long ago, 20, 25 years ago, but it still seemed like, the Earth, the Earth Day was already 25 years old, the original Earth Day. The movement was already decades old, but it still felt like, it was like this novel thing for people to talk about environmentalism or conservation. I feel like it's become much more sort of part of the common conversation now. People are aware of these issues and potential impacts. I feel like, there's certainly still a lot of things happening because people are trying to make a buck or selfish interest, but I feel like generally there's more concern for, certainly from a government perspective, there's more government interest in trying to make sure things are done with sort of ecological lens. But I think industry and business are trying too in many cases. So I think it's come a long way.
Well, that's good to hear.
Yeah. doesn't seem as novel as it used to be. You know, it doesn't. I don't feel like it used to feel like. You know, it was you were sort of like this weird person in the room if you were a professional conservationist or caring about these things. Now I feel like everybody's on board.
It's at the tree hugging hippie,
Exactly.
and now it's a
yeah.
little bit more mainstream.
It's a little more mainstream now. Yeah, you don't feel like such a weirdo anymore.
Probably the listeners can hear in the background here. We are outdoors. We are in
Yep.
nature. We're hearing the birds. We're here at the Scully Estate. Let's bring it down to a little bit more of a closer level here locally in Suffolk County. You know, we have birds, we have fish, we have small woodland mammals. You know, what is there about, you know, for wildlife conservation that would be relevant to us here on Long Island and in Suffolk County? I mean, there's no big game that people might think of lions and tigers and elephants.
We have coyotes making a comeback on Long Island, and river otters. They're both, I think, we call charismatic megafauna. And, you know, Long Island it's a pretty amazing place. You know, I didn't know Long Island when I first came. I thought Long Island was, you know, Brooklyn and Queens all the way out. And I was pretty amazed when I got here and for the first visits and got to see the, you know, the beaches and the bays and wetlands and open space. It's pretty spectacular. And the thing that's great about Long Island is it's where it's positioned on the coast. It's kind of at the southern range of many northern species, and the northern range of many southern species. And then it's on the the flyway, Atlantic Flyway. It's along the coast, so you get a lot of mixing. My colleague John Turner likes to call Long Island a migratory motel, because it's not just the resident species that are here. We get a tremendous number of species moving through, and birds obviously, but also insects and marine mammals and fish. And, there's a lot of coming and going happening on Long Island. So that's part of what makes it really diverse. You get a lot of diverse habitats and diverse wildlife.
What are the current threats to some of the conservation and the wildlife that we have here in Suffolk County?
Well, historically, the biggest has just been development. I mean, I live in Nassau, where it's just the disregard for wildlife. I mean, it seemed like there was no regard at all. I mean, everything was carved up. There were, the streams were developed right to their borders, or they were buried. I mean, many places they just put a pipe in the ground and built right over them. So that the public enemy one, as far as nature on Long Island goes, was just development and the density of building, and the dams that were built, the roads, the culvert, undersized culverts. I mean, the infrastructure was not done with any concern for wildlife. That's gotten a lot better. Things are moving in the right direction, but there's still a lot of problems on Long Island. Wildlife problems related to the legacy of the infrastructure and the development.
What about some of the contemporary issues, such as global warming and the hurricane threats to the coastal flooding?
Yeah, those are both big. The issues with global warming and sea level rise are significant on Long Island for people and for wildlife. I mean, we actually just launched a new program to try to address the nesting colonies of terns and other seabirds. These are a lot of birds. A lot of people call seagulls, but they're terns and gulls in some cases that they nest on beaches and coastal habitats. They've lost. They used to nest on the ocean beaches. In most cases, they've been pushed out of those sites because of human use. They nest. Their nesting season is June and into July, and obviously those are places where people are hanging out during those months. They've lost sites to development, of course, and then as the available habitats have shrunk, they've been now they're left to sort of more marginal spaces, including these marsh islands and marsh edges, where they're really right at the water's edge. And there's already too many anecdotes from around the island, the South Shore in particular, where their chicks are just their nests are drowning, and during high tides and storm surges and other storm events. So we're trying to sort of help identify places where they can move up, get out of harm's way a little bit by ironically, it's funny that looking at some of the dredge spoil islands, the historic dredge spoil islands that were, built in the 40s, 50s, 60s, when we were dredging boat channels and taking the spoils and dumping them onto marshes, which was destroying the marshes, of course. But those dredge spoil islands now are 4, 5, 6 feet higher than the marshes were, and potentially a really important habitat for wildlife going forward, because it's one of the few places they can get out of harm's way. So that's one example of the ways wildlife is going to also have a hard time as sea level rises here on the South Shore, especially.
Now, there's been discussion on this concept of forced retreat, moving
Right.
away from the shoreline before, isn't it? Well, tell us
Yeah.
what that is.
Well,
exactly.
yeah, it's getting out of harm's way before the storms come. It's this. I mean, I don't think there's a lot of support for forced retreat as a strategic retreat, and incentivizing and encouraging people to get out of harm's way, and then limiting the ability of people to rebuild in places where they've already been impacted by storms. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Some places homes are being built and flooded and built and flooded over and over again, which, the water's not going to go down. It's only going to get worse, and it's not, certainly in places there are people raising their houses and you can rebuild up on higher ground, which, certainly buys you lots of time, and there's safe ways to do that. The problem is the supporting infrastructure then, the roads, the utilities. If your house is raised but your septic system is still at ground level, that's a problem. The public is still going to pay and support the infrastructure to be able to, the roads to get you to your house, to pay the emergency services to rescue you if there's a problem. So, from a broader public interest perspective, I think it makes sense to start looking at ways to get people out of harm's way, and that then becomes a great ecological benefit, because then you give these natural systems a chance to recover, provide buffer for people living upstream, and give species a place to get out of the way too. So, yeah, no, we're big supporters of that concept.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I imagine it's just because of all the development on the South Shore, it's not something that's been taken up at a community level yet.
Yeah, no, it's like the third rail. Nobody wants to talk about it. There's a few organizations have been saying it, and there's been no real government buy-in. I talked to one politician who told me that that'd be a second term or next term topic that could be talked about, like when their seats are safer. But it's tough. But there's so the big Fire Island to Montauk Point plan that the Army Corps of Engineers is working on, they had put hundreds of thousands of dollars aside for raising houses in places in low-lying areas like Lindenhurst and Mastic, and instead of trying to incentivize those people and buy some of that space. One of the issues is they couldn't buy pieces individually. They needed to buy big blocks. So if you had a big stretch of beach and you wanted everybody out, and 2 or 3 people didn't want to leave, then the Corps couldn't do it. That was their holdup. But there's got to be government ways around that. They got to be able to figure out ways that people let people stay in their homes for a certain amount of time, or for the life of the current owner, and just not and then try to figure out ways to slowly, strategically get out of the way.
Yeah. As a whole, how is the political climate for conservation and the environment here in Suffolk County? I mean, I think
it's great. I mean, it's so much better than it was decades ago. I think there's broad support for conservation and dealing with climate change. Of course, that's not everybody, and there's you can always nitpick on the margins about things, but on both sides of the aisle in Suffolk County, at the county level, at this our state representatives, and up to the federal level, there's there's support on both sides, and really great elected officials that are really green, both parties. So I think
that's
it's pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So let's talk about things a little bit closer to the ground and the water. What kind of projects is Seatuck working on now, for environmental and wildlife conservation, and what are those impacts?
Yeah, well, one of the things we're working on this spring, because it's the season for it, is this vernal pools. So vernal pools are these temporary bodies of water that either in the course of months or sometimes years will persist and hold water, but eventually dry up and then come back again when there's lots of rain or snow. So they're not permanent ponds or lakes. And one of the things they're important is because they're not permanent, they don't hold fish populations. And because they don't hold fish populations, they're really important habitat for a whole host of wildlife, especially frogs and salamanders, because they lay eggs in these ponds and they don't get consumed by fish. So they're really the primary breeding habitat for these species. And they're a beacon of health for all the surrounding woodlands, because most of these frogs and salamanders and insects, other invertebrates, they don't really live in the ponds full time. They live in the forest. They just use the ponds for breeding. So they go into the forests. And so if you have a healthy vernal pool or vernal pond, it means you have really healthy woodlands around it. And so they're a great indicator of where on Long Island we still have good habitat and where these places can be saved. I mean, a lot of our vernal pool habitat has been lost over time to development. And still to this day, many of them are not protected by DEC wetland laws because they fall into the jurisdictional threshold, which is 12.5 acres. Most of them are not even an acre in size, so they're all quite small. So they're still at risk, and so what we've done is launched an effort to sort of piggyback on work that DEC has done over the past 10 or 15 years, and really identifying all the remaining vernal pool habitat on Long Island, mapping it, conducting a survey through this. We have a protocol in place and sort of inventory the pond, and then we sort of try to create a ranking system where we rank them, and then starting at the top and the most important, the healthiest ones, is making sure they're either in public ownership and protected, and if they're not in public ownership, or even in cases where they are in a state park or something, ensuring that they're being managed in a way that's protecting their health and the health of the many species that rely on them.
Well, we have some noise pollution.
Yeah, that's not a bird.
That's an airplane. We're kind of on the flight path right now, I think, for a couple of different aircraft. But that's the joy of being outdoors at Long Island.
Yeah, we got two planes overhead, actually.
So we'll just give a moment to let these guys get over us.
But we're about a year in on that vernal pool project. We got some funding from the Long Island Community Foundation for that work, and we assembled a really who's who of Long Island herpetologists and naturalists to help us. And a lot of these places are tucked away in little parks and woodlands here and there, and we got a pretty good start on the map. We have a couple of years worth of work left, but we're going to start already. We know where some of the most important and most at-risk places are, and we're already going to start trying to make sure they're cared for and protected. And the species, I mean, you talked about sort of big things, but some of the critters that rely on these vernal pools, the salamanders in particular, they're called the bistamid salamanders. They spend most of their life underground, under the leaf litter, foraging for food, but they go into these pools in early spring, late winter to spawn, and they're awesome. They're these yellow spotted salamander has these bright yellow dots. There's a blue spotted one. There's a tiger salamander. They're big enough to fit across your hand, and wow. They're really spectacular wildlife. Oh. And great, lots of great frogs. And one of my favorites are the fairy shrimp that rely on vernal pools. These little crustaceans that swim upside down and gather in huge numbers when the conditions are right. We try to build some education programs into these, and it's sometimes not. It's hard to know exactly when the timing is right. But when you get people out of vernal pool when the timing is right, and the salamanders are active, and the frogs are active, and the fairy shrimp are everywhere, they're pretty magical places. So pretty unique habitats. So that's an example of something we've been working on the past couple months. But
and then quite a bit of several years you were doing the dam and stream restoration projects.
Yeah, that's still our primary. I mean, that's our top project, I would say, over the past 10 or 15 years. It's our river revival project, and it's really looking at rivers and streams across Long Island. We mapped them of 140 or so total systems, where there's a freshwater connection to the bay. And I say these streams, a lot of them, you could step over them. They're small, but they're an important part of the terrestrial landscape. Lots of terrestrial wildlife relied on them, but they're also an important part of connecting the uplands to the bays, and they were avenues of travel for wildlife. They transported sediments and nutrients, and really connecting these two different types of habitats. So when you're talking about Long Island as a coast, think about it as a coastal place, and trying to address, improve that coastal health of that coastal ecosystem. Rivers and streams are an important part of that. So one of the things that happened is they were, almost all of them were dammed, and we know one or two systems that never had dams built on them, but they were all dammed, mostly dammed more than once, sometimes dammed a dozen times, to power grist mills or sawmills, years and years ago, to create impoundments to collect ice and harvest ice. Cranberry bogs, there were cranberry industry on Long Island for a while, and in other cases just sort of recreational and aesthetic interest, just to have a pond instead of a stream. Every one of those barriers, every time a dam was built, it was blocking access to habitat for species that were trying to move upstream or downstream. Blocking sediment that was trying to move downstream was important for the salt marsh health downstream. The biggest example are the migratory fish, the diadromous fish we call them. The fish that are diadromous are fish that move between freshwater and saltwater. They split their life cycle between the oceans and freshwater streams. And obviously everybody knows at least one of these fish. The most famous diadromous fish is the Pacific salmon, the one jumping over grizzly bears and up waterfalls on the Discovery Channel. We never had grizzly bears in Long Island. I'm not actually sure if that's true. We never had salmon on Long Island. Our rivers and streams just weren't big enough. But we have fish that are like them, river herring, two species of river herring, alewives and blueback herring. And they essentially have the same exact life cycle. They grow up in the ocean, they live in the ocean, they come back into freshwater to spawn, they hatch, so they start their lives in freshwater, and they drift, they eventually move downstream into the ocean, join the adult schools in the ocean on the continental shelf, and after 3 to 5 years they come back in to spawn. So, and in the process they're taking ocean-derived energy. They're growing up as juveniles to adults, spending 3 to 5 years out there, eating plankton and growing up, taking that ocean energy, and then they move into the bays and into the rivers. And in the way they bring all this ocean energy in, when they're in the bays, they're being preyed upon, the adults, by seals and stripers and bluefish. They get into the rivers and streams where they're then great blue herons and raccoons and osprey are picking them off. And then every female can lay 250,000 eggs. Every one of those little tiny bits of ocean-derived protein, is now being consumed by any number of invertebrates and other fish species and frogs and turtles.
So when you talk about the food chain, that's really the basic level that feeds up right up to up to us, up to people.
Yep, they are. We say it's no exaggeration to say they're literally helping to drive our coastal food chain.
Oh, wow.
Yep.
Now, you had mentioned earlier that coyotes are returning. Were they native to Long Island originally?
No, they've never been on Long Island. So coyotes were really just a western species. They were on the Great Plains and the Southwest and really most of the West, but they were sort of pinned to sort of marginal habitats by the more dominant carnivores, the wolves, bears, mountain lions. But over time, as we remove those predators from the landscape, and they're all basically extirpated from the eastern part of the country, the coyotes found themselves with some room to roam, and they started moving eastward, 100, 150 years ago, and expanding. It's a natural range expansion. These niches were available, so they were filling them as an apex predator, moving into places where the apex predators have been removed. So two major population movements, one across the south, in the southeast part of the country, and then another over the Great Lakes and down along through New England and south. And those two movements have basically filled in all the niches in New England and the south, and have moved to the mid-Atlantic. And Long Island is basically the last place they haven't colonized.
How are they getting here? I mean, they hopping the bus and coming down the LIE, or
catching a ride. They're very capable swimmers, so it's very possible that they're jumping across from points in the Bronx or Westchester and swimming to those northern Queens and northern Nassau sites. But more likely they're coming across the bridges and railroad trestles. We look at places like the Governor's Island, where there's a bunch of railroad trestles and bridges and that jump across from Manhattan and the Bronx. And in the early, sort of late winter, late fall, early winter, the adults from the previous year, the young from the previous year are sort of adults already. They're 10 months, a year old, and they get pushed out. So they start exploring, and they're trying to find their own habitat, their own territory. They're territorial species. They pair up and have territories. So they're on the move. They're nomadic for a while, and they're moving from place to place, and they'll settle in somewhere and get pushed out by the resident pair, and they just keep moving. So at some point they find new places, and that's how they've expanded their range, and why they've ended up in northern Queens a few times. And the first there were a couple coming in over the past 10 years, but the first successful mated pair settled into a little woodlot near LaGuardia Airport in 2016, I think. And the airport did some clearing of the woods to expand parking, and they already had a litter of 10 pups, and they had to move them a little bit, and then they were identified by some of the workers there, and people started feeding them. They're little puppies. They're very cute. So it's not surprising that they attracted attention. And then as soon as people start feeding them, they get more used to people, and eventually the Port Authority decided that they had to remove them all. So there were they trapped and killed them all. One apparently escaped and is thought to still be there. But there's been new adults have been coming to Long Island and settling in. And 2020 was I think we'll look back at 2020 as an important year, because there were 3 confirmed pairs together on sites in northern Queens and northern Nassau, in places where they were safe, and they were not likely to be harassed or to come in any conflicts with people to the point that where they'd have to be removed. So we expect that we don't know for sure that they've had successful dens. We expect they've tried, and they'll try again this year. But we think that those 3 pairs are going to be the launching pad, as they have young, and those young disperse over the coming years, and then it just multiplies at that point. And once we sort of talk about this coyote alley where they're sort of running between north of the LIE and between the points where the bays come down, and there's sort of narrow band there where they have to sort of run that gauntlet and get through there. But once they reach western Nassau, and then once they get to Suffolk County, they don't need thousands of acres. They don't need hundreds of acres. They need little patches here and there, and they're going to be fine.
Is there any indication of how many there are in Suffolk County? Has there been an accurate count, or?
In Suffolk?
Yeah.
No, there's not many. We had one show up at Robert Moses last January. So it's been seen we think it's the same animal that's been seen at Fire Island. It's out in the wilderness area now. So that's one. And then there's 2 thought to be on the North Fork, and it's possible they came from the archipelago of islands to the east, not from Nassau or Queens.
But for an animal that's not originally from Long Island to make its way here through, one of the most developed parts of the world, New York City and Westchester County, It's pretty amazing to think about.
No,
that,
it's
how
amazing. But there, it's amazing until you look back. You look at like Chicago. There's like 1,000 coyotes living in Chicago. Washington D.C.'s got thousands of coyotes living in Rock Creek Park and places. They're in every city in the country, in every suburban area. I mean, they're basically everywhere. I mean, they've proven themselves to be very adaptable, very capable of living in and around human habitation, and they're coexisting. I mean, there's stories, anecdotes here and there, but if you look at the numbers of coyote any attacks or bites, I mean, it pales compared to the problems that people have had with just dogs, domestic dogs. I mean, they're really good at, they're capable of just being purely nocturnal. They'll stay out of the way. They live on the margins of human habitation. They stick to a wild diet. They're not really scavenging garbage and things like that. So unless we give them a chance, that's why we've been saying, like, we know coyotes can be good neighbors. The question on Long Island is whether Long Islanders can be good neighbors and do the things, the couple steps that are going to avoid conflicts. Not leaving food outside. If you have a dog, don't put your dog's food outside in the yard, in the driveway, or whatever. Secure your garbage. Try not to attract rodents with lots of over bird feeding and things where you get rats and things around. Common sense stuff. If you live in a house that backs up to a natural area, or you live on the edge of Connecticut or something, or along one of the greenways, and you have a little dog, don't let your little dog go running out into the woods, or even in your backyard by itself, or your cat. I mean, the coyotes are going to perceive those as prey. They eat small mammals and other small prey. That's what they do. So those are steps that people are going to have to take. And there's just going to be a few adjustments, and then the coyotes are coming, and we're not going to be able to stop them. So it's a question of, it's really up to us to try to minimize conflicts.
Well, they're definitely on their way.
Yeah, no, the scientists say within a decade they'll have colonized the whole island. They'll be everywhere on the island.
Now, we know that Seatuck does a lot of environmental and conservation work. What else does Seatuck do? You have public programming.
Yeah, no, we have a big education component. That's a lot of what we do. And people say, why are we doing education work? Why is a wildlife conservation organization doing education work? And it's because we're trying to build a constituency for conservation. We want people to support wildlife conservation efforts and policies, and that starts with people understanding why these things are important, and they have to care, and the caring starts with experiencing the natural world and understanding it. There's a famous quote from a Senegalese naturalist at a United Nations conference from 1968. His name is Baba Dayoum, and he said, "We conserve what we love what we understand, and we understand what we're taught." And we say even more fundamentally than being taught is just what we experience. And people know that especially kids today are not growing up the way earlier generations did. They're not outside, in the open lot down the street, or in the woods, or at the bay mucking around, getting their hands dirty. They're on their phones. They're on their devices. They're in front of a screen. They're living much more structured lives. They're not developing on their own connections to the natural world. They're not having the authentic experiences in nature that most of us took for granted when we were younger. So a lot of what we do is to try to get people, mostly kids, just outside into nature. And it doesn't need to be, the middle of the Pine Barrens or Connecticut Park or somewhere pristine. It just needs to be anywhere, in their schoolyards, in their backyards, in their neighborhoods, just encountering the natural world in some way. And that's where the connection starts. That's where the understanding starts. And then once that builds, then the ethic, the conservation ethic comes naturally, I think. And then those are the people that support wildlife conservation.
Do you have any suggestions of what a family could do together, or with their children in their hometown or in their yard, even for a mini conservation project, so they don't have to necessarily go on a fish counting program with you folks. What could they do in their own backyard to be part of the conservation movement?
Yeah, the thing I would suggest, the easiest thing and really really an important thing is just with their gardening is just try to plant some native plants, and those native plants will attract native insects and pollinators and birds that are rely on those plants, and you'll only not only be providing habitat for these species, but you'll all of a sudden add lots of life to your yard, and things for your kids to chase and admire. We're sitting here at the Scully Estate, of course, which is 10 or 12 years ago. We planted all the beds here with native species, and when these plants are really at their peak in the late summer and fall with flowers, and the pollinators are all over the place, and it's always amazing to me because we also add in some planters here with some exotic plants and things. So you could have we have some exotic plants with these huge gaudy flowers on them, and you could be standing over near the New England asters, for example, in the fall with these tiny little purple flowers, and every one of them will have a bee or a wasp or some sort of insect, a butterfly or moth on them. And you can look over at the exotic plants and it'd be nothing, not a single bug on them, because these insects and plants evolve together over time. And you bring a flower from Asia or Europe or South America and put it in a garden, they don't have any use for it.
Yeah. Now, if someone doesn't know what the native plants are there any resources?
There are some really great resources. There's an organization called the Long Island Native Plant Initiative. They have a great website. They have plant sales throughout the year. They're a great resource. There's a lot of the garden centers are starting to carry native plants. There's a garden out in on the East End called Long Island Natives, has a tremendous supply of plants. But most garden supply places are carrying native plants now. There's great resources online. Federal government, state governments are getting better and better about making this information available. There's some great books, but the sort of Pied Piper of this has been a guy named Doug Tallamy, who's written some great books about sort of backyard habitat and how important it is, not just for your own interest and having some things for your kids to look at, but from a broader perspective, like we collectively can make a difference by adding to the habitat availability for all these species. So yeah, you don't have to look too hard to find good information on native plants these days.
And if they wanted to get involved more with projects and volunteer work, do you have programs and opportunities for that?
Yeah, one of our biggest initiatives over the past 4 or 5 years has been building our what we call community science projects. So this, the project we started with was related to the river herring I talked about earlier. These fish coming back into streams in the spring. We have 100 volunteers that go around the island looking for these fish. We've trying to identify where these remnant runs of fish are, and then how they're doing as they're growing. And we've expanded that now. We have community science projects on diamondback terrapins, bats, river otters, vernal pools. There's lots of places and ways to get people involved. So at seatuck.org, our About Us tab lists them all.
And you guys are on all the socials, so Facebook?
Yep.
So if someone wanted to get in contact with you folks, it would be through seatuck.org?
Seatuck.org, our staff at seatuck.org is our email. Okay. Yep.
And then you have a Facebook page where people can...
Yep.
Keep involved with you there?
Yeah, we try to stay active there and post a lot of the programs and activities.
So we've gone from the global to the macro, to the backyard of what people could do with their families and the native plants. Is there anything else you can think of that we'd want to end with, and what people could do, on their own to make a difference? Just
get outside, find some kids and get them outside and get them connected. Give them some authentic experiences with nature, and that's the first step. After that, it's easier and easier.
And from that, we'll have our next generation of conservationists.
There you go. We're always trying to. Our education team says they're in the business of growing future conservationists. So
that's great. Well, thank you very much, Enrico. This was, great information, great insights to what's going on here on Long Island and Suffolk County. And we will follow up with you on some of the results of your other projects.
My pleasure, Craig. Anytime.
All right, thank you. What an amazing amount of information from Enrico Nardone, the Seatuck Association, on wildlife conservation and the state of the environment here on Long Island and in Suffolk County. We went from the global right down to what you can do in your own backyard to help out with conservation. If you're interested in learning more and you found this conversation interesting, please remember to go to the show page at suffolkcurrent.com, and we'll have other information linked to it that Enrico had brought up, interactive activities and other information that you might find useful in being part of the environmental and conservation movement here in Suffolk County. Also, I'd like to thank our show sponsor, Great Bay Communications. They did the editing and production of the podcast. And if you are a not-for-profit or a business in need with help with your content marketing and your other communications, give them a try. They could be a great resource for you, and you can reach them at greatbaycommunications.com. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to having another conversation with you soon. Thank you.